Tatsalach Oikaloma. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Beth Piatot. I'm the director of the Arts Research Center. It's a great joy to welcome you to the Loft Hour today. Be sure and grab some food. The concept of the Loft Hour is that we all elevate our day. We share food, we share laughter. We have three of our colleagues here, two of them to share their work, and a moderator who invites conversation. So that's the Loft Hour. And today I'm very happy to announce that we'll be honoring and hearing from Tadiwa Madenga from the Department of English and Comparative Literature, Juliana Ramírez Herrera from the History of Art, and welcome her colleagues here too. And our moderator today is Zaman Saleh Nassali, also from the History of Art. The Loft Hour, we're in our third year, and a fun fact is Zaman Saleh was on our very first program. So we're very happy to see how people come and become part of the community and keep circling around and keep contributing in such profound ways to the growth of our community here at the Arts Research Center. The Loft Hour is sponsored by the Arts Research Center with support from the Dean's Office of the Division of Arts and Humanities and co-sponsored by the Department of English. One thing I would like to mention is that this is the 25th anniversary of the existence of the Arts Research Center. And so we have, as you might expect, 25 events, and which fit perfectly on a bingo card. But here we are in spring term. I just want to give you a quick preview of what is still remaining in our year of celebration. Be sure and grab one of these. Also grab some buttons. And at the end of our program today, we have some extra special swag. We have these beautiful screen-printed T-shirts, I Must Art, which comes from a poem by Layli Longsoldier. Layli herself will be here on April 1st and on April 2nd. On April 1st, she'll be giving a reading. On April 2nd, she'll be having a conversation with the amazing Salman Sharif in the English department. And a couple weeks ago, we had a group of students who did a letterpress workshop and created these broadsides from which, based on excerpts from Layli's work. So all of these things will be available. So be sure and stay to the end of our program today, not only because it will be juicy and amazing, but also because two lucky winners will receive T-shirts. Okay. I also want to give a shout out to Gail DeKosnik, whose original play, The Philippine Deep, will have a reading this weekend on Saturday and Sunday. And then also we have one last Loft Hour coming up for this year on April 9th. We'll be featuring Shiban Banerjee and Alexandra Lasada with a moderator, Estelle Tarika. So we're really looking forward to closing out the year strong with that last Loft Hour on April 9th. Okay, without further ado, allow me to introduce our moderator, Zaman Saleh Nassali, who will then introduce our speakers today. Zaman Saleh Nassali is currently finalizing her first monograph, provisionally titled Nostalgia Before and After Apartheid, Archival Art and the Figuration of the Black Subject. In this work, she interrogates how restorative nostalgias generate visual epistemologies that sanitize, disavow, and aestheticize oppressive racial histories, challenging the conventional view of nostalgia as merely an affirmation of Black social life. A central and consistent theme in her scholarship is a critique of image-based rituals of anti-Black violence. Her broader research and teaching interests engage critical theories of Blackness in visual art, with a particular interest in African modernisms and the tradition of global art movements in the African diaspora and Africa. The subject of her forthcoming second book project is the citationality and curatorial adaptation of the Black literary tradition into visual art. Zamanseli is a co-editor and contributor to The Imagined New, or What Happens When History is a Catastrophe, working through alternative archives. Zamanseli, welcome.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Beth. I am so relieved to be here and not presenting. Yeah, I mean, it's so lovely to see all of you, all your friendly faces. I'll just begin by introducing Juliana, who will be our first speaker. Juliana specializes in the arts and archaeology of the indigenous Americas, particularly those of the so-called small-scale societies of pre-conquest and early colonial Panama, Colombia, the Caribbean, and Amazonia. She received her PhD from Harvard University and her MA and BA from the University of Toronto. Her first book project, tentatively titled Astronauts in the Rainforest, The Metallurgy of Darien, examines the entangled histories of metal body ornaments in the Colombia-Panama borderlands, from pre-conquest gold to 20th century silver coin jewelry. Her work has been supported by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies, among others. From 2024 till 2025, she was the Shirk Postdoctoral Fellow at the University of Toronto and the Gardiner Museum of Ceramic Art, where she reconceptualized and curated the new gallery of ancestral Abiyala. And our second speaker is Tadiwa Madenga. Tadiwa is an assistant professor jointly appointed in the departments of English and Comparative Literature. She is a scholar of African and Black diasporic literature, gender, sexuality, and festivals. Her research is concerned with the relationship between literature, sexuality, which she traces through 20th and 21st century African book fairs and their subgenres, which are keynotes, bookstalls, magazines, and poetry. These interests converge in her current book project, which focuses on the emergence of African queer literature and politics through the Zimbabwe International Book Fair. Alongside her academic work, Madenga creates booklets, zines, and collages that experiment with displaying literary archives. These include the booklet, The Garden Letters of Yvonne Vera, which was a collaboration with the Cape Town publisher Chimurenga, and a complementary zine called Vera's Gallery that was exhibited at the 2025 Coventry Biennial in the United Kingdom. Across her academic and creative projects, her reading and practice centers archival work and site specificity as critical methods of literary analysis. Madenga's research has been supported by various fellowships, and grants at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences, the Center of Black, Brown, and Queer Studies, and the Hutchins Centre for African and African American Research at Harvard University, and the Arts Research Center at the University of California, Berkeley, right here. So please join me today in giving a round of applause in advance to our two amazing speakers.
Okay, thank you everybody for being here. I recognize many of my undergraduate students, so that's very sweet. Yay! Thank you to the Arts Research Center, to Tadiwa, and to Zama for facilitating the conversation. Today, I am going to talk about my current book project, Astronauts in the Rainforest, The Metallurgy of Darien, which is specifically about pre-conquest gold body ornaments from the Colombia-Panama borderlands, but more broadly about the following question. How can we, meaning archaeologists and art historians in the Euro-American Academy, study the displaced, the destroyed, and the stolen within regimes of knowledge that bind material culture to fixed temporal and spatial coordinates. The question guides the project because virtually all the surviving pre-conquest gold body ornaments from Darien have been looted and exist in decontextualized public and private collections. This process of destruction and extraction started in the early 16th century. It was in the rainforest of the Colombia-Panama borderlands where Europeans found at last the vast amounts of gold they had been searching for over a decade in the Antilles, and therefore where the Spanish established the first mainland urban center, Santa María la Antigua del Darién, for enslaving indigenous people, looting their towns, and desecrating their graves. Why is this going automatic? Sorry. I thought I had fixed it, but no. These activities, enslaving and pillaging, were the activities that financed and propelled the Spanish conquest of America. The quest for gold drove the Spanish across the isthmus to the Pacific Ocean, a route that played a pivotal role in the encounter and conquest of the Inca Empire, and that later realized, though a bit further west, so not in Darien proper, Western aspirations for global circumnavigation with the construction of the Transoceanic Canal. Despite this central role in the emergence of the modern global age, Darien has remained on the margins of history. The region is a contradiction, a point of contact, and a gap, as manifested by the 97-kilometer stretch of rainforest that interrupts the Pan American Highway, which runs from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego. But even in its contradictions, Darien is contradictory. In Spanish, it is not called the Darien Gap, but the Tapón del Darién, which literally translates into plug. So which one is it? The gap or the plug? Archaeologically, the marginalization of the region could be, and in fact has been attributed to colonial destruction and to more recent illegal excavation and trade of indigenous objects. And here I'm showing you two maps, one from the 70s, one more recent from 2022, neither of which show Darien highlighted as a metallurgical region. The question then, how can we study the displays, the destroyed, and the stolen within regimes of knowledge that bind material culture to fixed temporal and spatial coordinates is a genuine epistemic question. But the question is also an exclamation of reproach. Not, how could we do that? How could we technically, practically do that? But more telenovelistically, if I can invent an adverb, how could we? For dramatic effect, let me embody the position of the objects and ask me, the scholar trained in the Euro-American Academy, how could you? How dare you seek to bind us to the fixed coordinates of time and space required by the very regimes of knowledge born from our displacement and destruction? When the objects scold you, you listen. And so today, I am introducing you to the methodological adventures the objects have taken me on. It all started here with this necklace, a piece of jewelry used by the Herrera, one of the indigenous groups that currently live in Darien. This beaded necklace features crisscross patterns in multiple colors and, importantly, along the upper edge, a double row of silver coins from the United States, Venezuela, and Panama, some clearly repurposed from other pieces, as their perforations suggest. I do not have time to go over why and how the Herrera started using silver coins for body ornamentation, but happy to talk about that in the Q&A if that's of interest. Suffice it to say that as a pre-Columbianist, what I liked about silver coin jewelry from Darien was that it seemed to offer a counterpoint to colonial plundering. It seemed to reclaim metal for body ornamentation, performing a kind of reversal of the melting for bullion of the indigenous gold objects looted in the 16th century. However, Although I could clearly see this juxtaposition in the objects, in what they were doing, it was hard for me to formulate it academically. And in part because the ethnic connections between the Herrera, who arrived recently to Darien, and the indigenous inhabitants of the Colombia-Panama borderlands from before and at the time of the Spanish invasion is unclear and indeed contested. So I had, on the one hand, these two objects that I could see aligned next to a huge disjunction, clearly result of colonial violence and displacement. And so rather than to try to fix that disjunction, which brought me back to the opening problem, how could I dare do that, bring order to violence and explain the unexplainable, I stayed with the objects with what felt like a beautiful synchronicity. Where the necklace take me has been revelatory. Turns out this necklace was a gift from the Herrera leader Antonio Zarco to the American anthropologist H. Morgan Smith. Zarco and Smith collaborated in the 1950s and 60s at the U.S. Air Force's Tropical Survival School in the rainforest of Darien to train Army men and NASA astronauts, including John Glenn and Neil Armstrong, commander of the Apollo 11, and the first human to walk on the moon. In an interview he recorded for the NASA Johnson Space Center Oral History Project, Smith mentions that the training was supposed to take place within the Canal Zone, but that he decided to expand it onto Herrera territory. Quote, Antonio Zarco was so wonderful. If anybody got disoriented or lost, somebody with a radio would be there and would ask Antonio to bring them in. He was especially nice with the astronauts because we told him these people are going to the moon. Well, the Chocó spirit goes to the moon when they die. Put those two facts together, and these guys were being trained by the people whose spirit will end there, end quote. Smith was correct to point out that the moon is significant in the Herrera worldview. He calls them Chocó because they speak languages from the Chocó family, but Herrera, which means people, is how they call themselves. It is not, however, as Smith mentions, that the Herrera spirit goes to the moon after death. There is a lot of separation in his statement, separation between body and spirit, between now and then, or life and death, and between here and there, or Darien and the moon. For the Herrera, the moon, more than a place, is a sacred presence associated with silver and Caragaví, the first Haibana or shaman, the creator. The moon exists in another realm, but not in the afterlife. The Herrera body does not have to die so that the spirit may travel from here to the moon. The realm of Caragaví coexists with the terrestrial realm and the underworld, and silver, in its embodiment of lunar light, mediates between these realms. During his interview, H. Morgan Smith said that in 2001, in a visit to Panama, he, quote, had two 1921 Morgan silver dollars. My name's Morgan, so I have some, which I give to special friends. And so I gave Antonio two of them, because silver is their, the Herrera, favorite color or metal, end quote. Zarco, Smith continues, quote, did that beaded necklace, presumably this one, with silver coins and gave it to me. He gave one silver dollar back to me and said to give it to his friend, John Glenn, end quote. Smith's remarks and the necklace Zarco made for him evidence important aspects of the role of metals and body ornamentations in the Colombia-Panama borderlands that I believe hold validity across time. Although metals clearly have symbolic significance, especially as they relate to celestial energies, this significance in the Colombia-Panama borderlands seems rooted in their exchange for the purposes of forging social connections rather than in their association with specialized esoteric metallurgical knowledge. The metal in Zarco's necklace was not mined, smelted, or cast by the Herrera. Instead, it came from coins acquired through trade, coins that originated beyond Darien and from different time periods. Similar patterns of exchange can be traced archaeologically and have been described in colonial sources, not just in Darien, but in the larger region of Istmo Colombia and the Antilles. Okay, but now I have not two, but a bunch of disparate things. What this necklace has shown me in this journey to the moon is that the space race was the first time humans brought their things into space and left them there. The archaeology of these objects poses similar methodological challenges as the archaeology of pre-conquest metallurgy from the Colombia-Panama borderlands. Exoatmospheric objects, like the displaced, the destroyed, and the stolen, exist in ceaseless movement, and tethered from the decay of terrestrial gravity, they constitute, as space archaeologist Alice Gorman demonstrates, archaeological sites that are not quite, quote, solid condensations of artifacts hundreds or thousands of years compressed into layers perhaps only centimeters deep, end quote. Space archaeology demands that we think outside of Cartesian and Euclidean paradigms that portray space as flat and archaeological objects and people as fixed in time in specific stratigraphic coordinates. A similar challenge is presented by pre-conquest metallurgy from Darien, not just because of colonial violence and displacement, but because for the Emberá and other indigenous inhabitants of Darien, the territory was relational, enacted, rather than provided, through the exchange, among other things, of metal body ornaments. These objects fostered reciprocal social ties among humans and non-humans and across different realms of existence. In this sense, the dissipation of artifacts, whether careful and deliberate or forceful and violent, does not constitute a loss of context, but the context itself. Euro-American insistence on archaeological context is not, in this case, quote unquote, responsible or positive response to colonial and neo-colonial plundering, but in fact a tool of the colonial enterprise for both material and discursive dispossession. Freefall may be the only way to reckon with these objects, to be in relationship with them. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for where you ended, because we're going to be free falling from this point on. I really mean that, actually. You're laughing now. Okay. I'm very excited for this talk now because the second row, as they yayed MIT and booed Harvard, I was like, art history is fun. I don't know what's happening in that department, but I've always wanted to be in there, and this is the closest I'm gonna get. So thank you to the Arts Research Center, Beth and Laurie, for inviting me. Zama and Juliana, I'm excited for the talks we've had before and what we're gonna talk about after. And just to give like a quick context to my presentation, I think what I do is really simple, but I don't know, everyone else gets very confused when I say this. I'm a literary critic, and then the next question is usually what genre do you work on, novels, poetry, and I say book fairs, and this is where the free fall begins because it's either like delight or horror or, you know, something. So this is notes on book fairs. We're gonna figure out what genre they are. The presentation will be in 3 parts. So we'll start with really notes on book fairs. I should say they're kind of crowdsourced-ish. That's just like a legal way to say I can't completely say all of the opinions are reflective of my own. The second part would be a short interlude that just talks a little bit about my book project, and then I'll end with a riff on my favorite little book called Jacaranda Journals, which kind of proposes its own notes on book fairs, and all the images that you'll see, especially the photographs, are from the 1995 Zimbabwe International Book Fair, which is what I work on, but we'll start with some more general notes. So, Also, it's okay to yay or boo if you feel moved, you know. All right. This is Notes on Book Fairs. Okay. 1. If you want to enjoy a book fair, leave your partner at home. I wanted to see if people love their partners or not. Let's keep it moving. But if you love them, bring them with you. 3. Like most genres that invoke the tradition of notes, book fairs are difficult to define. Most book fairs are not permanent sites. They appear and disappear annually. This does not mean they have no outline, mood, or history. Quite the opposite. Book fairs are spatial assemblages of book displays, stages, nooks, corners, bushes, toilets, and clearings. They are what Suzanne Sontag once called a fugitive form, but here today I speak only of African and Black diasporic book fairs. I don't know about the others. That's just, I don't know what's going on there. 4. Not all book fairs welcome a fugitive sensibility, nor are they fundamentally radical. On a national level, most book fairs are state-funded events. On an international level, most African book fairs are territories of the Western print industrial complex, which the scholar Bwesige Mwesigire has with such precision and wisdom called the House of Random Penguins. 5. When I say that book fairs are a fugitive form, what I mean is that they're more than a market space, and that they should be understood as a performance space. In this performance space, there's an equal emphasis on the practice of reading books, which we might call literacy, and the practice of reading people, which we might call shade. What makes book fairs charming or brutal is that they attract an audience that can perform both, what we might call a double consciousness of reading. See this basic example. It's not to say you guys are basic, but I love books, but I hate the people who make them. This is a common sentiment at book fairs, says the attendee, the writer, and the reader. Okay, this scene is for Zama specifically because she knows this writer called Tadiwa, who's a really awkward lady, but great writer. All right, so let me paint the picture for you. We're in Herrera at the Zimbabwe International Book Fair. Tadiwa, author of Nervous Conditions, sees Chinua Achebe, author of Things Fall Apart. She has read his books, was moved by them, and felt overwhelmed by his sudden presence at this book fair. She walks up to him and says, "I feel like I must bow to you." Achebe looks at her and says, "Now, why would you do that?" So in this scene, we might at first see, sorry, the scene does not appear, but stay locked in. In this scene, we might at first see the normal understanding of book fairs as a site where global canons are created. The most read Zimbabwean novelist, Dangaremga, meets the most read Nigerian novelist, and really African novelist, in what could be a moment of passing on the baton from one generation to the next. But a festive spirit reveals itself through this failed encounter. So an overwhelming feeling to bow is a festive feature of a performance space, a place where Wole Soyinka once said, meals become feasts and greetings normally simple become ceremonies. But Achebe's refusal to be addressed as an icon, what I like to call the elegant uncles of African literature, reveals book fairs as sites to explore the pleasures of role play. The canonical writer cosplays as a humble reader. The broke poet is a photographer. The photographer is a sex worker. The sex worker is looking for their politician. The president is poet. The poet is a legislator. The legislator is gay. The lesbian's a novelist, and on and on and on. 7. This one's for Juliana. The entire space becomes a magnetic field of tensions and conflicts. It is eventually transformed into a sphere of power revolving around its own axis like a planet in outer space. It incorporates the architectural space of material or immaterial walls unto itself and becomes a magic sphere made still by its own motion, but it is potentially explosive, or rather it is poised to explode. That is why the state, a repressive machine, often targets its nervous eyes on the performance space. For even if it does not explode, might it not, by its sheer energy, through its laser beams of power, ignite other fields? Okay, but Tadiwa, do book fairs have sexual personalities? That's what my colleague always asks me. And this is the last note. They do indeed have sexual personalities. Okay, look up at the great constellation of fairs and festivals of the 20th and 21st century, and you will see that they all have zodiac signs. Their sexual personalities can thus be determined by season, meaning a calculation of time and space. Take the Zimbabwe International Book Fair, for example. It took place at the end of July and the beginning of August. Would call this a festive Leo. She is committed to the renewal of entire people. She is not a separatist, but strongly prefers Pan-Africanism with a small p because she does not like big men. Loves music, loves dance, loves masquerades, loves the moon, loves the spirit, loves love, loves purple, not lavender for people who know the reference. Okay, so my book project, and I won't go too much into some of these genres, partly because I am allegedly writing them as we speak. So instead, I'm going to talk a little bit about why I focus on one specific book fair. And for those that don't know about the Zimbabwe International Book Fair, it started in the 80s and it really got to its height in the 1990s. And it was the biggest book fair in sub-Saharan Africa. We will never beat Cairo. Cairo Book Fair, for those who've gone and know, is the biggest. And I support North Africans, so I can't say mean things, but you should go. And that was its own feat, and yet it's really actually just usually talked about in relation to the 1995 Zimbabwe International Book Fair. And in part because 1995 was the first year that the Gay and Lesbian Association of Zimbabwe was able to get a book stall at the fair. And then the book fair tried to make it this big deal and ask all the exhibitors to bring all the queer books that they had as like a moment of kind of opening things up. And then the state said no. And so they banned the Gay and Lesbian Association from participating, and then the opening speech was then President Robert Mugabe, who, this isn't like completely true, but that's a different tangent. But it's known as the first time a president said homosexuality is un-African, which he didn't say exactly that, but those were the sentiments. And so for African queer studies, it becomes this origin story where a lot of anti-gay bills come afterwards in the 90s and 2000s. But the book fair itself kind of disappears into the background, and then people don't realize that the Gay and Lesbian Association actually still had their stall at the fair. There are a lot of protests and debates that happened. And so my project tries to think, what does it mean to kind of recreate that event? And would we read it differently if we knew how to read book fairs, if we knew that like the peak of a book fair is a keynote speech? So let's find the keynote speakers. Like, how do we read a book stall, which itself looks like a little book with wings? How do we read these kind of smaller objects as subgenres of a book fair? And so I'm going to end with a particular book that is helping me think about reading a book fair, and will also explain some of the things that happened in '95. All right. So in my journey to reconstruct the book fair, I try to find all the books written about Herrera in the mid-1990s, which had queer themes or any queer characters. One of the books I became obsessed with was called Jacaranda Journals by the writer Melissa Myambo. It's unfortunately out of print and also impossible to find a physical copy anywhere. I'm saying this because it's true, but also because my graduate students are here, and I feel like one of them is gonna like email me next week and say, "You are old," and I found it on eBay, which will be it's a win-win for everybody. So a few years ago, I did find a physical copy in the library, and I was really good and didn't steal it, but I regret not doing that every day. I did make a PDF copy though. So the book is a fascinating collection of short stories, plays, letters, and other little experimental forms. It is set in the mid-1990s, but there's actually no mention of any book fair, and all the stories are set in October, which is Jacaranda season, but not the book fair season. So at first I was disappointed, but then there was this recurring question that kind of tied together all the stories, forming an emotional refrain for the book. And the question was, is a jacaranda tree indigenous or exotic? And so if you're someone who knows a lot about the book fair, there's three major things that would make it feel like this writer definitely was there. And one of them is because the book fair triggered a parliament debate about whether or not homosexuality was indigenous. Another very subculture thing I noticed about the book, one of the stories was on the Jacaranda drag pageant, which was a real pageant that happened in Herrera, and I was like, this person either is queer or has queer friends, because it wasn't a mainstream thing. And then the third thing was the Zimbabwe International Book Fair took place in Harare Gardens, and all the stories, as you can see by the kind of contents page, are named after have these botanical names, and they're named after ideas of documentation, such as like diaries, archives, newspapers. And it's kind of trolling, actually, the idea of documenting something. And so I was like, I don't know, there's something here. So I found her email, and then she was like, how did you find me? It was on page 2 of Google. So it wasn't, it was not this impossible task. And I asked her if she had attended the 1995 fair. And as it turned out, she had been to the fair and written most of the book's first draft on site. And she had been there in her early 20s. She refused to give me her age or what country she was born in or what country she currently lives in. She loves mystery, loves music, loves mystery. And she was hanging out with her friends at the book fair when she started hearing the debates on homosexuality. And she was filled with so much rage that she began to take notes. So she looked around and she saw protesters from both sides, those for homosexuality and those against, putting up posters and police ripping them down soon after. And when she looked closer at the shredded posters, she saw phrases like the Shona word for gay, hungochani, but she couldn't tell if it was a slur or if it was something that was being reclaimed. She looked around at the various attendees of Harari's subcultures who did not like speaking to each other and wrote a story inspired by each collective, for some of them a praise song, and for others a little curse. So while at first glance it would seem like there's no record of the book fair in the book, something more foundational happens. The literary form of the book fair, of the book itself, rather than the narrative content, resembles the structure of a book fair. The fragmented short stories look like scattered bookstalls in a garden, and the slogans from the debates and the shredded posters appear and disappear throughout the book. But the strangest part of this literary map of the book fair is the book's insistence on being read and also on being buried. In a short story structured as a letter to the editor of a fictional newspaper called Jacaranda a Florescing Daily, the speaker provides instructions on how to read the book and by extension on how to read a book fair, which goes as follows. Quote, to rearrange the picture, the petals, the symbols, the words, the worlds. Good luck. because I found that the future is in the past and the past is in the future, and they keep throwing up random loose connections attached to nothing and going nowhere. So I'm very sorry, and if you don't like reading this book, I understand. There's a lot of notes throughout this book that I just like. Life means nothing, and I have a fetish for those kinds of notes. I was like, tell me more. So this is the part of the talk where I conclude by revealing the meaning to all this, which I confess I don't have, because I chose to sleep last night. I was like, what is a jacaranda? Like, what is the day? And said, I'll riff tomorrow. But what I can say is this. Each time I return to this book and its resemblance to a book fair, in the way that everything hides in plain sight, that everything is buried and resurrected, in the way that at every turn there's a tension between things being found and things being taken away, it confirms what I already know to be true, that a book fair is at its heart a Black elegy. Thank you.
Am I audible now? Okay, great. Thank you both for such terrific presentations. I mean, how do I respond to this scholarly extravaganza? So I'll start with you, Juliana. The fascinating tension in your archaeological work is that you primarily deal with objects that have been looted, or objects that are absent. And I'm thinking about the gold objects in this instance. And listening to your presentation, you present to us how these objects are constituted through relationships, or this dynamic of exchange. And so I want to ask you about your methodology. How do you methodologically respond to the prevailing sense of absence and loss without overlooking the dispossession, the initial dispossession?
Thanks, Emma. I'll try to be succinct. So, but right now, I'm guided by indigenous artists, and specifically my students will know. Gliceria Tupinamba, she's a Tupi artist from Brazil, and she recreated Tupi feather capes when she discovered them, like learned about them. There's maybe 11, I think, that exist from the 16th century that were looted and are in Europe. And she has a very creative, novel, amazing relationship to these objects. She describes them as landmarks, and she finds it hilarious that European museums have to spend so much money looking after these feathers and tending these objects and caring for these objects. So she says, the Tupi also colonized Europe, and she's just flipping the whole thing upside down. And so, short answer, I am following the example of Gliceria Tupinamba and other indigenous artists that are really questioning what it means to be dispossessed, or absent.
Tadiwa, you are a literary critic, scholar, and you approach book fairs not just as events. You approach book fairs as a genre in and of itself, but they are event-based and ephemeral in their constitution. So I'd like to ask you how your methodology responds to the fleeting nature and their performative aspects that which they function.
That's a great question, because I should say technically the Zimbabwe International Book Fair still exists, but not as it was known to exist. Meaning that I think about it methodologically in two ways. One, I do go to like Herrera Gardens and I just kind of sit around and wait for Herrera Gardens is next to the National Gallery. It's where everyone comes in and out. All the scholars will come in and out. All the writers will come in and out. And they'll be like, what do you work on? And I just literally point and be like, the book fair. And everyone says all their memories. And so I get to remember it in that way versus now it's a very tiny, more like school kids based fair. And the other thing that I've started doing is going to a lot of other book fairs to try to understand how to read the archive for the Zimbabwe International Book Fair. So like I know a keynote is important because I made the mistake of one time working at a book fair, which I will not do. And I had one job, which is to make sure the keynote speaker gets to the thing. And I was like, why do they only give me one job? And the keynote speaker was elderly. No one just said it blatantly. I don't know if you like legally can't say like they're old, so you can't let, they will get lost, and everything stopped as they did get lost, and as I was trying to, things stopped because everything has been scheduled around a keynote. So that's how I learned, the keynote has to be like, it's not just this headliners, there's a real function and meaning to this thing. So methodologically, you're right, because you need to go to live events to understand how to even like return to trying to re-narrate something that happened when, well, I was technically alive, but I was a baby. So something that happened back then, yeah.
Well, I'll open the session to the floor. We have exactly 4 minutes. So please ask a concise question
Questions.
Well, if no one else is going to take up these precious minutes, I will. I have a question that I'm hoping can land for both of you. Juliana, I was so taken with this idea of survival, and I think we think of the moon as like the American desert, for example. So thinking about what they thought they were doing vis-a-vis survival there. And then maybe for you, thinking about the book fair, do you think about it in relationship? I was thinking about like Walter Benjamin's article about the library, for example, like thinking about, especially when you describe the structure of it as being like a book. So whether you think about this idea of survival or permanence in relationship to kind of other engagements with books. Okay, that's it, survival.
Okay, I'll be quick too. Yes, the survival school is hilarious. They trained not just in the rainforest, but also in the desert. And it was primarily just because they didn't know if there was something went wrong and things exploded and they landed in a jungle and they had to like survive. It lasted for 3 days, okay? And the indigenous people were like, he's lost. So I don't know how well trained. Yeah, I don't know how well trained they were. But Morgan Smith did try. He says his goal was, the reason why he expanded it into a meta territory was to make it an intercultural experience. So it does have this connotation of like, who knows what we're gonna find, and better have these guys experience difference.
I'll give the professional answer about books, and then I wanna talk about the moon. But I'm like, let me give some credit to my field. I mean, yeah, book fairs have a huge role in terms of renewal of like literary traditions in many ways. Though I would say maybe the strongest might be some of the performance genres more than print culture itself. In part because part of the downfall of the book fair is about economics and whether publishers are able to survive or all come to the country and that kind of thing, versus performance poetry kind of can happen with or without like these grand book stalls and structures and that kind of thing. So I think about the book fair as an important space to think about literary circulation and to think about like community, to think about elegies as places where writers are remembered and then they do actually pass on the baton. But I want to think about the moon because I do think about book fairs as festivals, which is a slippage that is tricky. And in Zimbabwe in particular, when I tend to ask the white organizers how they would describe the book fair, they always thought about it in relation to the Frankfurt Book Fair, and which did fund the book fair, but they thought of it as more like a business thing, a trade fair, and that's the language they always used for it. But if you ask like Black Zimbabweans what they thought about the fair, firstly, it's like people came not just to buy. It didn't matter whether you could buy a book or not. They came because the real thing everyone knows is that's the first, Harare Gardens is the first place where settlers started creating Harare. So it's where all the festivals happen. So even after the book festival kind of died, there's music festivals and so on. And then whenever something bad happens or weird happens, they say, well, why wouldn't you think that would happen in that place? So there's sort of a feeling that that place generates festivals, not just trade spaces, but there's something about the ritual of gathering there where sometimes it's a good time and sometimes it's a bad time. Like sometimes it's a place to hook up, sometimes the police is here. It has that kind of like the moon is out energy. Yes.
I was waiting for the moon. You were many places before the moon showed up. Okay.
Are there any more questions, or would you? Okay, well, I'd like to. Oh yes. Okay. Okay. So you search giveaway.
First of all, a huge thank you to this amazing group. And then before you go, just check under your chair. If there's a little Post-it that says you're a winner, then come get your t-shirt. You are a winner. Everything is compostable and recyclable. Come get your shirt. And thank you again. This is amazing.